Thank you, Armida. Choir, Sue for the solo. Thank you. All right, our gospel reading this morning comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And again, we listen for the word of God as we hear what Mark has recorded. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, who was a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." While many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and he came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. Thanks be to God for these very holy words. Well, entitled today is Cry Out to Jesus. Might have been inspired by the praise song. And I'm wondering, have you ever gone to like a really big concert or sporting event? Well, when you're there and you're in the crowds, it gives us a bit of an idea what the scene would have been like in our gospel reading from Mark. So Jesus was in Jericho. It's the oldest city in the world, and it's about 24 kilometers from Jerusalem. And he was preparing to make his final triumphant entry into the holy city. Now, as it was Passover, Jericho would have been filled with thousands upon thousands of people who'd be journeying to Jerusalem. Now, Bartimaeus, the blind beggar man, he was sitting at the side of the road begging for the coins that he needed to keep him alive. Because you know, as unfortunate as blindness is in our time, it was so much worse in Jesus' day. Today, a blind person at least has the hope of living a useful life with proper training and equipment. Let's face it, some of the most skilled and creative people in our society are visually challenged. But in first century Palestine, blindness meant that you would be subjected to abject poverty. You lived at the mercy and generosity of others, and unless your particular kind of blindness was self-correcting, there was no hope whatsoever for a cure, because the skills that would be necessary were still centuries away beyond the medical knowledge of that day. Now, although Passover was a major feast, the fact that Jesus was in the area, that would have added to the excitement. His fame then was at an all-time high, and his reputation would have preceded him. Many of the people in Jericho would have been trying just to catch a glimpse, maybe get a blessing or some wisdom from this renowned teacher. William Barclay writes, Bartimaeus could not know what lay just ahead for Jesus when he got to Jerusalem. He couldn't know that the Master would be crucified there and this opportunity would never come again. He did know, however, that the opportunity was right then, right now, and he wasn't going to allow it to pass him by. When he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Well, this identification as Son of David is important. It would have had a really great impact on the people in the crowds, because it would have identified Jesus with royal lineage, but it would also identify him as the Messiah, who was expected to be a descendant of David. Well, we should also note that in our passage, Bartimaeus is concentrating on Jesus, not on begging from this huge crowd that would have been a real windfall for him. Well, typical of the special treatment that people with infirmities received in those days, many of the people around scolded him, told him, "Be quiet." We'll talk about being on the margins of society. But Bartimaeus sensed this was his one big chance to be healed. If Jesus passed him by, all hope would be gone. So he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Well, Bartimaeus may have been on the edge of society, but he was a great deal wiser than many in those crowds and even more people in our day. How often do we see people suffer without hope? And how many times have we seen that someone when we look in the mirror? Suffering in silence, internalizing all our problems until they grind and they churn. They give us stomach problems and headaches and sleepless nights. We feel like we have to carry our burdens alone, that no one will understand what we are going through. How often do we hear, "What's the use of complaining? No one listens anyways." I think that's become much too common a phrase, and hopefully it's being used in jest, because otherwise it's a pretty sad commentary on how people view our society. Well, sometimes we know we're not happy, but we don't always know why. In our Old Testament story that Harriet read for us so well, Job had been suffering for 41 chapters. And before God made things right, Job certainly knew why. He had lost all his wealth. He had lost his family, his health. He had reached bottom, and he was crying out and challenging God as to why all this was happening to him. Well, the story is told that thousands of years ago, a young Chinese emperor called upon his family's most trusted advisor. "O learned counselor," the emperor said, "you have advised my father and grandfather. What is the single most important advice you can give to me to rule my country?" And Confucius replied, "The first thing you must do is to define the problem." Many unhappy people can't put their finger on what is really causing their distress. Many unfulfilled people can't even tell you what it would take to satisfy them. Many of us have no clear idea what our real needs, our real desires, and our real priorities are. And because we've never defined the problem or clarified our goals, we spend a lifetime anxiously wandering with very little to show for our pilgrimage. Roy Howard writes, "There's a certain clarity that comes from knowing your true condition as a human being, knowing who you truly are, underneath the surface of things, where you live with your hurts and your fears, your anguish and your hope. It sets you in a posture to cry out honestly for what you truly need." Well, we saw Bartimaeus. He wasn't afraid to cry out honestly, even after the people were telling him to be quiet so that they could enjoy the parade. He wasn't going to risk his future, which was the chance of a lifetime, by being silenced by those around him. And he's determined to get Jesus' attention and to get the help that he sincerely believes only Jesus can offer. So when Jesus hears his cry, he doesn't ignore it. He doesn't pretend he doesn't know where it's coming from. He doesn't think, "Oh, this mission I'm on is far more important." No, Jesus stops dead in his tracks, like there's nothing more important in this world than responding when someone cries out to him. We know that all through the Gospels, Jesus has always been attuned to marginalized persons, whether it was the poor, people with leprosy, tax collectors, prostitutes, women, children, foreigners. Jesus always had a special place in his heart for them. And when Jesus instructs the crowd to call him over, he's actually commanding the people to stop obstructing Bartimaeus and to start enabling him. Instead of going, which he could have done easily, to where the blind beggar is, by calling him to come into the crowd, Jesus is calling him in from the margins, giving him some dignity for the very first time. So Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus knew very well what he wanted to do for him. But teacher, the blind man answered, I want to see again. Now, Jesus could have healed the blind man without even asking that question. But instead, he gives him dignity by asking him. Jesus is empowering this lowly beggar, not by assuming, but by asking for his answer. The crowd told him to be quiet. Jesus is telling him to speak. Now, if you can remember all the way back to last Sunday, which can be a challenge, I know. Interestingly, it was that same question that Jesus asked of his disciples, James and John, in last week's passage, when they asked Jesus to do them a favor. He said, what do you want me to do for you? Well, Charles Hoffaker puts it this way, the blind man's petition is very different from that of James and John. He asked not to be seen, but to see. Not for honor, but for vision. Not to be superior to ordinary people, but to become ordinary himself. Not to rule over others, but to join them in their experience of a normal life. Jesus doesn't ask anything more of him than his honest plea. Go, Jesus told him, your faith has made you well. And at once he was able to see, and he followed Jesus on the road. Jesus said, your faith has made you well. And the Hebrew word for it means healed, means made whole, means saved. And in Bartimaeus' case, it was really all three. Well, a fellow named Lamar Williams writes, the healing of Bartimaeus, it's especially significant for those who sit outside the church. It calls attention to persons, though lost in the crowd, might be ready and eager for some vital contact with Jesus Christ. So this week, take some time to think of people you know who maybe are lost, and maybe they're ready for some vital contact with Jesus. And maybe you could start them on their way by bringing them here with you one Sunday. For this question, what do you want me to do for you? Well, the answer depends largely on who's asking it. A chef can provide lunch. A banker can provide a loan, sometimes. A teacher can provide learning. A parent can provide the keys to the family car. No. Or love, or a hug. But with Jesus, there's no limit. So how would we answer him? What do we want Jesus to do for each of us? Well, sometimes what we really need is what blind Bartimaeus wanted. We need Jesus to help us see, to see the blessings that we enjoy right now, to see the challenges and opportunities that lie before us, to see the worthwhile lives that we can live by serving Christ and our neighbors. Maybe it's to see the person at our doorstep who so desperately needs our help. And let's face it, sometimes it's hard to see the blessings we enjoy when the noise of the crowd deafens us and all our fears blind us. Like Job, we can sometimes feel that God has abandoned us. And like Job, we need reminders of all the great things that God has done. Amy Butler writes, I don't know what rituals of faith remind you of a time in your life when God was so close that you felt wrapped in the presence and comfort of God. Certainly there are at least one or two. Maybe it's our Christmas Eve candlelight service, or maybe Good Friday, or maybe a special service of communion that reminded us of God's presence. A lot of times it was a baptism, just like we had today. Or maybe majestic hymns one Easter Sunday or during Advent. What is that ritual that helps you to remember? And we need those rituals to remember because like Job, we're going to have times in our lives that the pain of our human experience cuts so deeply that we forget. We forget that God is right beside us, walking with us through the pain and the darkness, and we all know that the sense that God is absent, hiding from us, well, that's a pain that hurts more deeply than anything else. We need to remember the presence, the power, the goodness of God, especially in the times when we feel darkness closing in all around us. So maybe we can do it through ritual. There is something that helps us to remember that God is here. It doesn't have to be some supernatural experience of the divine. It could be as simple as when we say the words of the Lord's Prayer together, maybe when we're sharing bread or wine, or a lot of times when we're singing Go Now in Peace at the end of the service. Through all those things, through these rituals, we remember what we might forget from time to time, that God is here. No matter what, God is with us. Well, when the crowd comes down the road, Bartimaeus knows that Jesus is with them. Bartimaeus knew his true condition, and I think truthfully, so do we. We know what it is to hurt. Some of us know what it is to be shamed and shunned. Most of all, though, we know what it is to see, and we want that gift again. We've come to believe that this one walking down the road is the one who can change our life, the one who can make us whole, the one who can give us sight, the one who can bring us light. So please don't try to go it alone and keep it all churning inside. Because as we all sang together in our praise song this morning, there is hope for the helpless. There's rest for the weary. There's love for the broken heart. There's grace and forgiveness, mercy and healing. He'll meet us wherever we are. So cry out to Jesus. And cry out because we are not alone. For which we say, thanks be to God. Amen. Well, as we have been tremendously blessed in our lives, we bring forth our offerings with joyful hearts.